There's a troll in the dungeon, and there are loads of them out in European forests. But that's just one example of giant, elusive creatures that are still often sighted throughout the world today. You'd think that something so big would be well documented, but there's something about these strange creatures that keeps them a mystery to us. That's probably for the better. Something that big could wreak tons of havoc if angered or hungry. So, in the meantime, enjoy these allegedly real sightings of giant monsters from around the world. And if you've got a story of your own, you can share it with us at darknessprevails.org. Also, we're working on writing some novels as a community. If you want to join in, check my pinned comment below. By the way, this episode was made possible by the generous support of Raid Shadow Legends. Sometimes you just need to distract yourself from your worst fears and the paranoia of the things that lurk just outside your window. So grab your smartphone and download the super fun and very free game, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid is one of the most immersive experiences available on your smartphone, comparable in scale and quality to full-blown PC and console titles. Best of all, it's free to play. Prepare for an enthralling storyline, gorgeous 3D graphics, PvP battles, and something I really can't live without, giant boss fights. With hundreds of champions to collect and customize, each fight is unique, unpredictable, and always giving you a fun, new challenge. And just look at the detail on these champions. You might want to join in soon, as Raid is growing at a rapid rate, especially with an upcoming special launch tournament with crazy prizes. And hey, be sure to join my clan by searching my clan name, Darkness Prevails, with the clan tag DP66. If you download Raid for free today using my link in the description, you'll get 50,000 silver immediately and a free epic champion. But that's only if you click my link. That's 50,000 silver and a free epic champion. Thanks so much to Raid Shadow Legends for supporting the show and giving us all an easy and fun distraction from the horrors of this world. But these scary stories will not be kept at bay for long. The 40-Foot Tall Monster from DL. Location: North Bend, Washington. I was 16 years old living in North Bend, Washington, which was mainly covered in dense forest. I was going camping with a friend named Leo. We drove about an hour before we got to our campsite, then unpacked our things. A burn ban was in effect, so we could not start a fire. Instead, we just sat outside our tents, admiring the beauty of the vast forest. We were the only ones at the camp, which made the experience even more fun. That night, I was awoken by the sound of snapping. At first, I thought it was my imagination, so I tried going back to sleep. The following morning, I woke up to see that something was different. A large tree nearby, which had been standing tall and sturdy just the day before, had been snapped clean in half. What was even worse were the huge amounts of black slime that dropped from the splintered ends of the tree. Bewildered but mostly unconcerned, Leo and I decided to go for a hike. It was then that we discovered that multiple other trees had met the same slimy fate as the one by our tent. And then we saw claw marks. Huge gashes ran along the tree trunks, but they were at least 30 feet up. That night was when we saw the creature that had done this. Leo and I both woke up to a sound. It was like a quiet groaning. We climbed out of our tents and looked around, only seeing the black silhouettes of trees around us. But then I noticed one of those silhouettes was moving. It lumbered nearer and nearer. I could tell it was a creature. It was 40 feet tall and extremely thin, with long, swaying arms and a hunched back. It had a long yet graceful stride. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. Its torso and legs were covered in thick, long brown hair. Arms long and bony, covered in hairless skin. It had a round head and round eyes. From its mouth dripped the same black substance that we saw on the trees. It didn't seem to want to hurt us, nor was it interested in us at all. It simply walked around the forest, grabbing trees, breaking a few here and there, and occasionally turning its head and making a whistling sound. Eventually, it left. Leo and I just stood there dumbfounded, but eventually went back to our tents. The next day, we packed all our stuff and left. When we were driving, I glanced at the rearview mirror, and I saw a circular brown head sticking out from the top of the trees. I think it watched us drive away. Giant thing that followed us. From Hollie. Location: Utah. I'm 15 years old and I've lived quite a sheltered life, but not with many friends. I mainly just hung around with my parents. Yeah, it sounds sad, I know, but they're laid back and chill people. I didn't mind it. Besides, I'm not exactly the most social person anyway. I did have one friend though, named Lucy. She wasn't a Navajo, but her grandmother had Navajo background. Lucy was always very close to me, and she told me everything. I told her my everything as well. Even though we were so close, we were very different people. She, unlike me, was outgoing and ambitious, but hated going out past dark. However, I, on the other hand, being shy and reserved, I loved adventuring outdoors and camping, especially at night. One night, when we were just having a sleepover at her place like normal, she lived right next to 40 acres of forest, and I really wanted to go out on a night adventure. I had an urgent need, basically, to explore those woods, but Lucy refused to step out of her door past dark. I hated that. I just wanted to go have some fun. Because of this disagreement, we were in a bad mood, and ended up going to bed at 11 p.m. I remember waking up at around 2 a.m. I felt really excited for some reason. I was so eager, and I needed to get into those woods. It was like they were calling me. Without even thinking, I just put on a jacket and shoes, then left, trying not to wake Lucy. I made it to the tree line, and it was really dark. Pretty spooky, to be honest, and I was starting to have second thoughts, as I had a really bad feeling about it now. But the feeling and desire to get inside the woods, it overpowered my fears. I threw caution to the wind and walked into the woods. I began exploring and minding my own business, but I was still on alert. Soon, I began to hear twigs snapping around me. I ducked behind a bush quickly. Then I peered out, only to see Lucy frantically looking around, almost on the verge of tears. I climbed out of my hiding spot and asked her what she was up to. She looked panicked. She told me that she did not want to come out here, and that we need to head back home now. She grabbed me by the arm. I was so confused, I didn't even know how she found me. I'd been walking for a good 15 or 20 minutes in the woods now. Anyway, I agreed to go with her, because I still had that horrible gut feeling, which was only made worse now seeing her in such a state. She was so pale and silent the entire way back. That alone honestly freaked me out. I had never seen her like this before. Then, as we exited the tree line, we heard it. This howl. It was monstrous, unforgettable, demonic. It's hard to explain, really. It was animalistic, with a deep crackle to it. Lucy froze and stared behind us. I turned with her and looked, and I kid you not, A massive figure stood about 10 feet away from us. I gasped, and Lucy told me not to look directly at it, but I had already looked into its eyes. Eyes that I will never forget. They seemed to give off a yellow glow. We sprinted so fast back into her house, shutting every window, door, and curtain. She explained to me that she had seen that thing out there before. That's why she was afraid of going outside after dark. But obviously, she couldn't just say that some giant monster skulked around in the forest. She said she had woke up to the sound of me shutting the door when I left, and she instantly knew where I was going. But when she left the house, she could not see me, so she began to search, eventually finding me. But she admitted that the entire time she was in those woods, she could hear that creature around us. "Those twigs snapping," she asked. "You heard that, didn't you?" I nodded my head. She swallowed. "That's the sound it makes when it's following you." When I recall this event, it makes me quiver a bit. It happened 8 months ago, but the fear is as fresh as ever. Giant Thunderbird of Tombstone. From Silverwolf69. Location: Tombstone, Arizona. This is a story I retrieved from a trusted friend of mine. She wanted to get it off of her chest. For security, I'll be using her Native American name. It happened in the spring of 2018, so it's still very much fresh on her mind. In Tombstone, Arizona, Goldwing had just visited the Birdcage Theater with her friend Calm Stream. As they walked, they continuously heard wind blowing all around them. They were just eager to get back home and have lunch, so they ignored it and hurried on. But on occasion, Calm Stream would look around. Goldwing told him that he should stop, because the fidgeting was really ticking her off. But he replied, "I'm telling you, this wind isn't natural. What if it's a..." And then he trailed off. But Goldwing needed to know. She asked, "A what?" Calmstream just told her not to worry about it. Miffed, Goldwing just continued to walk. But when they were close to being back, they heard something that solidified Calmstream's fear. It was a massive caw, like a giant bird. But unlike a shrill crow, this resembled more of a thunder's boom. He looked up at the same time Goldwing did, and they both saw something beyond astounding. As they watched, a huge bird flew overhead. It looked like the same color as a crow, only scaled up to gargantuan size. Calmstream and Goldwing both agreed that it was at least 30 feet long with a 60-foot wingspan. In fact, it blotted out the sun for a moment as it flew past. After it was out of sight, neither of them moved for several minutes. Eventually, Goldwing said, "We need to go. We need to tell somebody." But Calmstream refused. He said his reputation wasn't going to be ruined by saying that he saw a giant bird. Goldwing decided to keep it to herself, but eventually told me about it. No matter what people may say, Goldwing and Calmstream are convinced that they saw a Thunderbird, though no one locally has seen it since that day. Or maybe they're like Goldwing and Calmstream. They've seen it, but they're afraid to report it. I wouldn't be too worried about it, because I've only heard one report in history of one of these huge birds actually attacking and picking up a kid in Alton, Illinois. That kid was badly frightened but survived. Then again, no one really knows what Thunderbirds are or what they're capable of. But Goldwing told me the next time she's standing in the open and a huge shadow comes over her, she'll be wondering if it was a cloud or something else. curly-haired monster. From Aaron. Location unknown. My friends and I were psyched about summer vacation. My friend Sam had a great idea about camping with all of our friend group. But I was worried about the idea, as I figured my mom would not let me go. She was one of those moms who was overprotective, to say the least. Once we asked around after school about who wanted to go, we each set out on asking for permission from our parents. I was again skeptical about this. As I said, my mom is not the most reasoning woman about these things. But to my surprise, she actually decided to let me go. She said it was a good way to get me off my computer. Not all of my friends were able to go, but a few others could, including my friends Sam and Jamie. Eventually, with the help from our parents, we decided on a campsite not far from where we lived. It was about a half-hour walk from my own home. On the second day of summer vacation, we set out with our supplies to the campsite. As soon as I left home, I had an uneasy feeling about this, even thought about canceling, but I was too hyped overall at this point, and there was no turning back. We set off and got to the camp around 5 p.m. When we got there, we started to unpack the tent my dad had bought us, which was a huge struggle for us, as none of us had a clue how to put it up. Eventually, we called it a day and gave up on the tent. This would turn out to be a mistake. When 7 p.m. came and went, we started to eat our poorly made sandwiches and even lit a fire. By then, we were having a great time, playing some games and talking about normal teenage stuff. After I finished my food, I set off down the campsite pathway, as I had an idea to see if there were other people around, like families and such. To my confusion, we seemed to be the only group there at the time. Just when I assumed we were alone, I caught sight of a curly-headed figure leaning against a tree. At first I was shocked, not sure what to do. But being my ignorant teenage self, I approached the man. He seemed odd to me and looked rather pale in the face. His chin looked crooked, and he had a blank expression. He saw me approaching him and immediately cleaned himself off, putting a smile on his face that I could only describe as creepy and off-putting. I smiled back and asked him if he knew where the rest of the other campsites were. His answer sent a shiver down my spine. There aren't any. He explained to me how he was the only other person around here, and questioned me about who I was with. Stupidly, I told him the truth, that I was on a camping trip with my other teenage friends. This seemed to give him a disturbing grin, one that I've never seen on another person before, and it made me uncomfortable. He noticed this and immediately changed the conversation topic. I wish he didn't though, as he began to ask me questions about how old I was and where the campsite was. I didn't like this, and I told him that I needed to get back before it got too dark. This made him angry, and before I could take off, he asked me my name. I panicked and told him my real name for some reason. He replied, simply telling me his name was Jack. After that, I ran back to camp and started to tell Jamie and Sam about my encounter. For some reason, they didn't react the way I did, and shrugged it off as not a big deal. A couple of hours later, closer to 10 p.m., we ran out of things to do and started to get to sleep. As we never got the tent set up, we settled under a tree. I was still way too shook up to go to sleep, so I decided to stay up a bit. About half an hour later, Jamie and Sam had gone to sleep. I began to hear a rustling noise close to our camp. The more I heard it, the more my heart sank, and I started to wonder what it was. I stayed down under my covers, just waiting for whatever it was to go away. But to my horror, it continued, and the noises even became more frequent. At that point, I was sure it was something serious, and maybe even that man from before. I slowly reached over to Sam and woke him up as quiet as I could. I told him I could hear something out there, and he told me to go to sleep. I was convinced, though, that someone was there, but being the passive person I was, I listened to Sam and I put my head down. Suddenly, a loud grunt came from the direction of the pile of tent. I rose immediately, and so did Sam. It was pitch black and we couldn't see much, but we did see something that I will never forget. A massive, long creature, curly hair all over it, exactly in the same shape as the man's hair from before. Sam and I leapt up and grabbed Jamie. We all ran from the campsite from that giant thing, but we could hear its loud hissing and slithering. We eventually made it to the road. We waved like madmen for the cars passing by until a man stopped. He picked us up, and we dialed the police. At this point, Jamie was crying and shaking. The police eventually met us. They went back to our campsite to find nothing except for our mess of equipment. I tried to explain what had happened the best I could and gave a description about the man and the creature. When they took me home, my parents would not let me go out after hours for a very long time, and let's just say that I didn't get any sleep that night. It's been 4 years since the incident, and we've heard nothing about who or what it was. I'll never go camping out there again, and I hope our experience will keep you cautious about what may lurk in the woods. Something in the Swedish woods. From Swedish Camper. Location, northern Sweden. As a kid, I always used to go hiking and camping in the massive woods next to town with my grandfather. I always loved listening to his stories about these woods as we sat around the campfire. He had always been a good storyteller, and the stories were always so engaging. It made the forest seem so much more vast and mystical than it really was. I ended up developing a big love for the woods, and it became a big passion of mine. Sadly, he passed away when I was 10 years old, but I still loved going into those forests, even with my grandfather gone. In the beginning, shortly after my grandfather passed away, my dad started to go with me into the woods. I guess he thought he would bond with me the same way my granddad did, but it wasn't the same. My dad had grown up in Stockholm and lived his entire life there before he met my mom and moved up north with her, but he had always remained a big city guy. He never really seemed interested in those woods or hiking and camping, but he went with me for some time before I was old enough to go with my friends. That was a lot more fun, to be honest. Obviously, as kids, we had wild imaginations, and the stories my grandfather had told me, although faked or exaggerated, fueled our imaginations. We had quite a bit of fun and adventures out there. Those were some of the best years of my life. Of course, eventually we all grew older, and we developed other interests. Even I did, but I still always enjoyed going hiking and camping in the woods, even as an adult. I would often go hunting too, after I got my license. Sometimes I went fishing in the small creeks and rivers that are in the woods. All those years going into those woods, nothing scary ever really happened to me. I felt I knew the forest, and even though I enjoyed my grandfather's stories about the place, about the alleged creatures that lived there, I never, even as a kid, believed them. I never believed those sightings or tales to be more than just campfire stories, until a couple of months ago. It was early October, and I had gotten a couple of days off of work. All my friends and even my girlfriend were working, so I decided to go hunting in the woods, as the season had just started. I packed my things into my car and drove to a parking lot at the edge of the forest. Then I headed in. I decided that I'd stay a day or two and found a good place to set up camp. It wasn't until I was sitting by my fire, drinking my coffee, that I realized how quiet the forest was. Usually, at the very least, you could hear birds chirping or flying by, which I'd even heard when I parked my car. But it wasn't until now that I realized the forest had gone completely silent. It was a bit eerie and unsettling, since there was always at least some sort of noise, even at this time of year. I eventually let it go and went into my tent to sleep. I suddenly slowly awoke in the middle of the night to some strange noises coming from over the creek at the edge of the campsite. I can't really explain it, other than these strange grunting and gurgling noises. I listened to it, trying to figure out what it was, before I began to hear loud footsteps walking away. I was on edge for at least an hour or two, until eventually I got tired again and started to think that maybe it was nothing after all. Then I fell back to sleep. I woke up the next morning around 9, a bit late I thought, as I had forgot to set an alarm. I crawled out of my tent and walked down the creek. There was nothing of interest there that I could see. No trace of any animals either. I must have been dreaming, I thought. What else could it have been? I chuckled to myself, joking that it must have been one of my grandfather's fairy tale creatures stopping by to drink water from the creek in the middle of the night. I spent the rest of the day hunting for deer, but I didn't see a thing. I grew more worried at the apparent lack of wildlife, but at least there were some birds chirping that day. But still, I felt unsettled. It grew late into the night, and by then I should have seen plenty of deer. After all, these woods are quite full of them. But I hadn't even seen a rabbit, or anything else really. As I stood there baffled, I all of a sudden got the feeling that someone was watching me. A feeling that I'd never gotten in those woods before. I tried to reason with it, saying it was just my paranoia. The lack of noise and lack of animals had unsettled me, and maybe after all, those strange noises were getting to me too. I told myself that it was simply an irrational fear, and that I should try again tomorrow. I walked back to camp and prepared some of the food I'd brought with me, and still, despite my best efforts, I could not shake the weird feeling. Eventually, it was completely dark, and I went into my tent to go to sleep. But I was awakened that night too, to the same strange noises by the creek. I gave myself a little slap and confirmed that I was in fact awake, not sleeping. I eventually decided, after much self-persuasion, to go outside and check it out. I grabbed my flashlight, then headed out of the tent into the pitch-black darkness. I could hear the slurping sound coming from the creek again. As I looked over, I could definitely see the silhouette of something huge by the creek. At first, I thought it was an abnormally large bear, but I thought that bears were supposed to be in hibernation at the moment. But maybe not. I couldn't be sure. Maybe one of them had awakened early or something. As I stood by, baffled at what I was seeing, I shone my flashlight at it. It was a stupid idea. I was frozen solid the moment I saw it. It looked like a giant man sitting down drinking water from the creek. An extremely large and hairy man with a tail. I remember thinking, what the heck? How would a man have a tail, and how would they be so big? The creature noticed the light from the flashlight and turned around to face me. Its skin looked like that of a human, but slightly more pale than average. It had huge ears and a big misshapen nose, with large yellow sharp teeth. It stared at me with an angry face, yellow eyes piercing me. Then it suddenly stood up. It must have been well over 3 meters tall. It had a big hairy body like that of a bear, but more human in shape. It was staring straight at me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. My first thought was I was staring right at a troll. But how? One thing I forgot to mention at the start is that since becoming a teenager, I was always fascinated by ghost stories. Maybe it was something I carried on from my grandfather's stories. Yet again, it was something that I never believed. But seeing this monster before me, I did believe then. It's just common sense when you're standing face to face with a creature from your country's folklore. You can no longer deny it. I was lucky that I had used the bathroom before going to bed. We stared at each other for a few seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity. This thing's going to end me, I thought to myself. I'm going to be annihilated by something that shouldn't exist. As I stood there in disbelief, the creature suddenly bellowed this gurgling scream, exposing those sharp yellow teeth as it then charged towards me. I hollered back, dropping my flashlight and taking aim. I fired at the thing. It screeched again before heading toward the woods on my left. The flashlight had fallen in a way that it wasn't shining towards the area. However, I could still see its huge frame. I chambered a new round and fired again, but he soon vanished out of sight. I spared no time in grabbing my gear, save for my tent. Then I ran for my car. My knowledge of the woods did not fail me. I made it back within half an hour. I was running for my life, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, always expecting to see those yellow eyes and those big teeth ready to tear me to shreds. I jumped into my car and drove back to my apartment. I did not get a wink of sleep. To this day, I fail to wrap my head around what I saw. Did I really encounter a troll, or was it all in my head? Later that next day, some police came by to see me. Apparently, some other hunters in a cabin not too far from my campsite had heard me screaming and firing and went to investigate at first light, finding my campsite. I had left my flashlight behind and my name and phone number on it. I lied to them, much to my shame, and told them that a bear had stumbled into my campsite and I scared it off. Whatever became of that lie and that encounter, I don't know. I haven't gone back in the woods. It pains me to this day. Those woods were the ones that meant so much to me over the years, and now I'm too scared to go back. When you're confronted with something you always thought as nothing more than a bedtime story, your whole perception of reality changes. If you ever find yourself in the woods of Sweden, stay vigilant. There's something out there. The Stickmen of Northern Wyoming. From Gerber. Location, Wyoming. When I was younger, I witnessed something sort of strange. I used to go on walks around my parents' property in northern Wyoming. Since then, we have moved, but honestly, I don't miss it. It happened at sundown one evening. I was walking back alongside my mother's garden. I usually stopped there to pick honeysuckles. I was actually enjoying a few of them, when suddenly a strange whistling sound came from behind me. I turned and looked up toward the sound to see the weirdest thing. It was a straight pine-colored line that went straight up from the ground up to about 16 feet in the air. At first, I thought it was an oddly straight tree without branches. Maybe it had some sort of disease. But then this line turned on its own. As soon as it did, the whistling stopped and the line took form. It was shaped like a very tall, lanky, and unnaturally thin man. I'm talking paper thin. Its posture was terrible as its upper body slunk down. Its head was ovular, and its entire body was covered in that same brown, textureless color. But I wasn't afraid. I watched in amazement as the living stick figure turned and walked into the forest. Whenever the side of its body faced the wind, it would whistle past. I walked home, telling my parents about it, who simply thought it was the weirdest self-invented fairy tale that I'd ever come up with. I didn't believe in trolls until now. From Matthew RL92. Location unknown. Let me start by saying I was 15. I was young, naive, and quite the daredevil in those days. It was summer, and I had absolutely nothing to do. My friends were out of town, and my girlfriend had just left in the morning to Seattle to visit the family. As I lay in bed thinking of what to do, I got the crazy idea to sneak into the gated woods and see what was out there. Now here's a little history about those woods. Around the 70s or 80s, there had been rumors in my town about a troll roaming around the woods stalking hunters and even stealing children. In 1999, supposedly, a child was taken by the troll. 2 boys were playing hide-and-seek near the woods when one of the boys heard screaming. The boys looked around and saw his friend being dragged away by what he called a troll. He tried to help him, but the troll screamed such a horrifying sound, it made the child run away in fear. Ever since then, that's why they say the woods there were gated, though quite obviously people don't believe the story. As for me, I like to believe in a lot of things, like sea monsters, the Loch Ness Monster, and things like that. But trolls, definitely not. So I got dressed up. I walked for about 10 minutes when I saw the woods. As I approached the fence, I looked around to see if anyone was looking, and to my surprise, no one was outside. I climbed the fence, trying hard not to get cut by the barbed wire. I made it to the other side with very few injuries. I suddenly got a weird feeling there, though. I figured it was because the woods were extra creepy after dark. I started to explore the forest. Branches and twigs scattered over the ground. The occasional rabbit ran away from me. Everything was going good so far until the fog came. As I continued walking, I noticed fog was emerging from the woods. I stared at the fog until I realized I'd been walking for a while. It was dark, and the fog wasn't helping me find my way now. I decided to turn straight around and try to head back home when I heard a stick break nearby. I was startled. I turned and listened closely for another sound, but there wasn't one. I assumed it was a rabbit taking off, like the others had. I needed to get back home. I took off in a sprint, but something tackled me to the ground out of nowhere. When I looked up, I saw the ugliest critter on top of me. Black hair, black eyes, long nose, and crooked teeth. I was face to face with something that I did not want to believe in. It had a hold of my leg tight and had begun dragging me off. Using the blade I had been carrying in my pocket, I pricked at the creature in the arm, which caused the massive thing to let go of me and drop me to the ground. As it screamed, I wasted no time in taking off in a full run. It was giving chase, screaming behind me and gaining up fast. I made it to the gate, not caring if the barbed wire tore my shirt or skin this time. I ran all the way home, in pain all over my body, only once looking back at the gate and the now still and silent woods. I was thinking, there's no way that what I saw was real, but the bruise around my leg reassured me of my worst fear. The Giant, from the Moment of Gallifrey. Location: Budapest, Hungary. I live in the suburbs of Budapest, in a small town about 15 minutes from the city. They call it a town, but really it's just an overgrown village. It has the feeling to it and all. Lighting at night is scarce, but, and this might be the source of my luck here, our street is pretty well lit. So why was I lucky? Well, a few days ago I had to move out of my room and take refuge in the guest room, so my room could get repainted. The guest room was small, almost claustrophobic, and it has one large window, through which I could see most of our neighbors' houses on the side of the street. Our flat was on the first floor of the building, a nice 2-flat house with a big garden, though it was mostly empty. My room's window looks directly out into the garden, but the guest bedroom faces the street, which enabled my experience. One night as I was trying to sleep despite my insomnia, I started to hear a strange pulsing sound, like someone turned on loud music at one of our neighbors. But this was weird. It followed no particular pattern or beat, and yet it was strangely familiar. It wasn't until I realized it was getting louder and moving closer that it was the noise of something big walking down the street on two legs. Out of curiosity, I was already at my window, bathing in the lamplight coming from outside. I spotted it. The creature was vaguely humanoid with smooth gray skin, a head devoid of facial features or any hair, and 4 arms, the second pair sprouting from the side of its ribcage. It didn't look emaciated, but I could still see its bones beneath the skin. In fact, it looked oddly muscular, as if posing while strolling down the street. I forgot to tell the most important bit. This thing was huge. We lived on the first floor, and I was looking upwards from my bed through the window, but I still had to go closer to the window to look at its head. This thing was at least 20 feet tall, possibly bigger, and there it was, walking down our street in the middle of the night, calmly, looking around with its eyeless face, stopping occasionally to take a peek inside a house, then continuing its stroll. I wasn't scared at first. My reaction was closer to, what the actual heck? But that quickly turned to fear as it turned my way, its featureless face staring in my general direction. Realizing I was still in the lamplight, I quickly retreated and watched on from the shadows. The giant walked to our house and took a good long look at it. It stood there for at least 10 minutes, seemingly scanning the house for something. I dared not move, lest it would notice me, and God knows what it would have done to me if it did. So I stared, terrified at the monstrosity, its 4 arms dangling idly beside it, as it looked at me with that faceless face. Then it walked away. I was lucky I survived that night, but every now and again, I hear those distant footsteps, or a sound similar to them, and it makes me so afraid I can barely breathe. This is a classic story from a previous episode titled 8 Terrifying Things Seen in Lakes that aired in January 2019. The Loch Ness Monster's Cousin, from Kunoichi. Location, Scotland. It was only a few weeks ago that I went to my grandparents' cottage next to the loch in Scotland. I'll never forget what I saw there. I'm 15 years old. It was winter break from school, in America anyway, and my family was on our way to visit my grandparents for Christmas. The cottage was small but homey. It could barely contain all of us. There were 3 bedrooms in the cottage and the basement, which had a small room in the corner. The day after we flew there, we got settled in. It was already very late when we got to the cottage. After I put my clothes in a tiny dresser, I asked my uncle to take me out onto the loch. It was a little cold, but the lake hadn't frozen over yet, so we were still able to go. My uncle took me on the little motorboat to a small island in the middle of the small loch that my grandparents own. I overheard how, since it's Christmas Eve, all the stores had been closed down in town, so we'd have to go hunting instead. My dad stayed behind since he had a cold at the time. Anyway, when we made it to the island after about 15 minutes, Uncle Connor tied the boat to the dock, and we set up our supplies in the little hunting cabin. Uncle Connor sent me out to set up some traps. When he came out of the little hunting cabin, he was carrying a 12-gauge. I had mine with me already. We went a little deeper into the woods, soon coming upon the hunting stand that we'd be using. We were out there for a few hours before it began to snow. I had gotten a rabbit already. Uncle Connor had bagged 2. Once we saw the snow, we hurried back to the cabin to get our gear, then head back to the cottage. By the time we made it back to the cabin and checked the traps, the boat had frozen in place. The ice was thin, but we didn't see the need to get hypothermia trying to get it unstuck. We went back to the cabin to stay the night. I called my dad to let him know where we were. We put the game we caught in the freezer while Uncle Connor went to get some firewood from the pile on the porch. It was almost dark, so there wasn't any point in hunting some more. We had our leftovers from lunch for dinner, played some board games, then read some books until we got tired. There were 2 rooms, the game room and the bedroom. Uncle Connor got the bed since he had a bad back, and I laid in the floor. Luckily, we had 3 sleeping bags. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard the sound of some banging. I thought a critter got onto the boat outside, or something was messing around with it, so I got up, put on my jacket, then went to the door to turn on the porch light. What I thought I saw out there, it immediately shocked me. It was some sort of animal with a long, slimy black neck. Its eyes were huge, one on either side of its head. It opened its mouth, showing off long, serrated teeth. The body was fat with 2 large flippers in the front and 2 smaller ones in the back. It looked similar to a plesiosaur. I blinked and looked again, to see nothing there, but the boat was left badly damaged. It hadn't been a trick of the light. I saw a ripple from the corner of my eye, just in time to see something's head duck under the water. Down at my feet there were sliding tracks from the animal. I went inside, a little shaken, and tried to go back to sleep. In the morning, I saw that the ice on the loch had melted. Uncle Connor was making breakfast of some goose eggs he found nearby. He hadn't seen the boat yet, apparently. I went to the game room where there was a little stove that Uncle Connor was cooking on. I said to him, Did you see the boat?" "What's that?" he asked me. I heard a noise last night. I went to check it, and I think I saw something damaging the boat." He cursed and quickly went to check it. He needed to know if we could get back to the cottage. But the oars had been chewed up, so they were too splintered. Uncle Connor had his phone on him, so he called my dad. About an hour later, he showed up at the dock. Luckily, my grandparents had 3 boats. Anyway, my dad had brought some rope so we could pull the damaged boat back to shore on the other side. We get back to the cottage a little after noon and played in the snow while the women were in the kitchen making Christmas dinner with the animals me and my uncle hunted. We have a small family. It's just my parents, my grandparents, my uncle and his wife and kids. We had a delicious dinner, and after dinner we opened presents. Later that night, we were telling stories, and my dad said that his favorite story growing up was the one about Nessie's cousin. I was familiar with this. It was my least favorite story of all the ones I'd ever heard, but my father started to tell it to us. Once there was a farmer down in the lowlands. He lived a little ways away from the loch, but he went there every day to be by himself and pray. One day after a hard day's work, he went down to the dock to pray like he always did. He accidentally fell asleep in his boat, and when he woke up, it was dark. He was about to get up to go home when he heard a scary noise. It sounded like something between a gurgle of water and a growl. He was cautious because on the news he had heard about disappearances near the docks every night. He got up and peeked over the side, but he didn't see anything. He thought maybe it was just a seal or another animal, and he walked over to get off the boat. The small boat rocked as if something had butted against it, and the farmer landed on his bum. He thought it was just a rough wave and got off the boat. He walked to the end of the dock to gaze at the full moon when he saw a ripple in the water. The farmer thought it was a large fish, so he was walking away when he heard that same gurgle-growl noise that had woke him up. He turned around to see a long shadow rise out of the loch, maybe 6 meters in front of him. It was 2.5 meters tall and 5 meters long. It looked like a gigantic seal with a stretched neck. "Nessie," he called. "Nessie, is that you? How glad I am that I'm one of the lucky people that you show yourself to."
"Lucky,"
replied the monster.
"Why are you lucky? I'm not Nessie, I am Shadow. I am one with the loch. No one may see me until they are soon to perish,"
the monster called back. Then, before the farmer could react, Shadow, the fearsome loch monster, snapped up the farmer in his mouth. All that was left behind were his boots. On every last full moon of the year, a person goes missing. The last place that person is often seen is the docks, and on the dock, you'll find a pair of boots from the missing person. That's when a teapot whistled in the cottage and everyone jumped. My dad is an exceptional storyteller, so every time someone hears this story, it puts them on edge. We continued with more and more stories well into the night. At around 12:30, everyone went to bed. I was up watching a cartoon though, when I needed to use the loo. I turned off the TV because I was done watching it. I would go to bed when I was done. The bathroom was the closest room in the cottage to the loch. I had flushed the toilet and was washing my hands when I heard a sound. It was the sound. That sound like a gurgle and a growl mixed. I remember thinking, no, it's just my imagination. Dad scared me with that story. He does it every time. I hurried and finished up. I was walking out of the restroom when the sound came again. Once more spooked, I quickly reminded myself that I was simply being childish. It's only a kid's story. A story to keep them away from the loch at night. To face my fears, I went down to the basement to grab a flashlight. When I came up, I went to the door that led to the dock. I opened it and went outside, making sure not to shut the door behind me. I closed my eyes and breathed. I can't believe I'm going to do this, I thought to myself. I opened my eyes to look up at the sky. To my discomfort, it was a full moon, and that would make it the last full moon of the year. "Quit scaring yourself," I said. "It's just a kid's story." I walked cautiously down to the dock, stopping when I was maybe a meter from the edge. I saw something ripple through the water out of the corner of my eye. I backed up to the beginning of the dock because I didn't want to be at the edge of it. In front of me there was another ripple, a big one. I didn't like where this was going. I stayed put though, because I was going to prove to myself that it wasn't real. The story that has haunted me for most of my childhood is just that, a story. I saw something further out in the loch then. Another ripple, a moving ripple. One that was coming closer and closer, until it stopped a few meters in front of the dock. I saw a head emerge from the water, then a long neck. I was behind a tree at this point, scared. I was scanning the yard. When it got to the tree that I was hiding behind, it paused. I was whimpering like a baby, praying that it wouldn't get me. The thing had long serrated teeth as long as my finger. Its skin was black as the night, so were its eyes. But the scariest part was, it acted intelligent. The way it looked at me, the way it moved. It almost looked like it was smiling. Then suddenly, a loud bang rang out from the direction of the cottage. The monster seemed to jerk back, in pain, then quickly fled into the water. I fell to my knees, petrified. I felt my dad wrap his arms around me not moments later. He hugged me tightly, telling me that that story was a warning, and that I did the exact thing I was warned not to do. I felt his tears falling on my cheek as he asked me to never do that again. I stuttered, "I won't, Dad," to him. I stayed inside the cottage for the remainder of the trip. This is another classic story from a previous episode titled 4 Disturbing True Diving Stories that aired in April 2017. Creature Under the Boggy Water. From Untold Comfort. Location, Missouri. I live in southern Missouri, where there is almost zilch to do. Luckily, I'm much of an outdoors kind of person, so I often find myself outside, walking through the woods, sitting in the grass and reading a book. Stuff like that. A few months back, I decided to take a swim in a nearby pond. Now, don't get me wrong. This really isn't a pond like all the locals call it. It's huge, probably 150 yards across, with waters that reach about 25 to 30 feet deep. But still, to everyone here, it's just that pond. Anyway, one day it was pretty warm out, and the muddy water was actually beginning to look tempting. So without parents around to get onto me for swimming in the nasty water, I walked right in. The water was cool, though a bit gritty from the dirt. All in all, it felt nice, and I stayed in the shallow water, half on shore and half submersed, soaking up the sun while trying not to overheat. Suddenly, I heard a large splash. I gazed out into the distance in the middle of the large pond, and I saw huge ripples as if a big fish had just disturbed the water. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but it did catch my attention. So for a while I sat there and focused my gaze across the lake's surface, hoping to catch sight of more jumping fish. Well, I didn't have to wait long. Whatever had made those ripples came back, and as soon as I saw it, my eyebrows went lopsided. I had no idea what I was seeing. It looked like the tail of a jet black fish. It just came out of the water then slammed back down onto the surface. The thing was absolutely massive. Just the tail part alone that I had seen was bigger than me, and I'm about 5'9". To be honest, it almost looked like a tendril of some kind, but I pushed that silly idea out of my head. Ain't nothing in Missouri got tentacles, I told myself. So the next day came, and I was eager to go back to that pond. For one, it was hotter than it was the day before, and two, I really wanted to see that weird fish again. This time, though, I brought some diving goggles, so I could hold my breath and dive under the water for a while. They worked fairly well at the public water park, so they were worth a try at least, even if the pond water was cloudy. After a 10-minute walk through the woods, I reached the pond's edge. I took off my shirt and donned my goggles. I even wore swimming trunks for the occasion, which my parents must not have noticed. Then I walked in. I was instantly met with the same gritty coolness from the day before. It was both gross and refreshing, though that might sound a bit bizarre. As soon as the water was up to my collarbone, I dipped my face in the water to test my goggles and to see just how bad the visibility would be. But I was amazed. The dirt and mud floating in the water was only a thin layer at the top. I don't know what was in the water to make it do that, but about a foot below the surface the water was clear. I was so excited at this point, I began to rush further into the water. I didn't even think about it at the time, but I must have been making quite a commotion to all the creatures underwater. I tried to stay where my feet could touch the bottom as much as I could, taking in big gulps of air before diving several feet under the water, searching the bottom and looking for wildlife. But I was losing hope for getting another look at that jet black fish again. After several dives and seeing nothing of the sort, I was certain that I had scared it away with my commotion. But I continued to dive. It was fun enough, even if I didn't see that strange black fish again. After an hour or two, the sky began to get orange as sunset was coming into view. So I decided to call it a day with plans of coming out tomorrow already rushing through my head. I swam toward the shore, searching with my toes for the floor of the pond. But the first thing I felt with my toes wasn't sand or dirt like I'd expected. The first thing I felt was like wet rubber, and the moment I stepped on it, it pulled itself from under me fast, and then my leg began to burn as if it was on fire, and instantly I panicked. I started to thrash about, trying harder to get to the shore, now confused and terrified at what was causing the pain in my leg. I still couldn't feel the ground below me either. Then, as I paddled like a madman, something told me to turn around. I tried with all my might to ignore this feeling, but curiosity and fear forced me to. I turned around to face the center of the pond. Lo and behold, just below the muddy water in the pond, there was a mass of black, only inches from me. It was bigger than any creature I'd ever seen in person. It must have been about 17 or 18 feet long and 6 feet wide. My first thought was that I must have kicked up a different colored soil, clay or something like that. I couldn't move. I was terrified and in denial of what I was seeing. I floated there, staring at this mass of darkness. Then I had the stupidest idea. I wanted to look under the water, past the dirty layer, to see what this thing really was. I wanted to be sure that it was nothing. I wanted to confirm to myself that there was nothing to be scared of. Like the idiot I was, I readied my goggles and I dipped my head slowly into the water. Inch by inch, the debris gave way, and soon I was locking eyes with a creature that seemed to have jumped right out of a sci-fi movie. Its body was completely smooth, like if you touched it, there'd be no resistance, no scales, anything of the sort. There weren't even any fins that I could see. But that wasn't the first and most frightening thing that I saw. The end closest to me was apparently the face. I saw two off-white eyes that seemed to glow under the water. It reminded me of those glow-in-the-dark stars all the kids used to stick in their bedroom ceilings. Just under those eyes was a mouth with two large and very obvious fangs protruding downwards. This creature, it was just waiting there. Maybe it was blind and it couldn't see me, but it knew I was there. Maybe it was just waiting for me to move. I had no idea what to do. I stayed as still as possible, eyes closed. Then I pulled my head slowly out of the water. I breathed in slowly, now petrified. This thing, it could kill me easily if it wanted to. At least it looked like it could. But thankfully, after several long and painful minutes, the mass turned around and it swam away. The moment I could no longer see it, I raced to the shore, this time with no creepy creature problems to distract me. When I was on the shore, I quickly examined my leg, expecting the worst. There was a paper-thin cut about 8 inches long on my right calf. It burned still, but there wasn't much blood coming from it. Later on, it healed up just fine. But something tells me that it could have been much, much worse. I haven't gone back to that pond since, but every chance I get, I tell my friends and family the story of the monster I saw while underwater that day. Not too many people believe me, though.
When you begin to hear the giant footsteps, when the water turns dark, when something blots out the sky, it's already too late. You're but an ant to the gargantuan monster that's coming for you. There's no hope for escape. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you want to submit your own story, share it with us at darknessprevails.org. If you'd like to support the show, go to patreon.com/darknessprevails or go to teespring.com/store/darknessprevails to check out our shirts. Now then, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about 5 thunderstorm horror stories. Bori Chua says, "Here we go. I got my diaper on, so let's go DP." I've never met someone so prepared. Joey Clark says, "Wow, I'm actually having a thunderstorm right now. It's always fun to do these storm videos and to see who's having a rainstorm at the moment. It's always happening somewhere, and I'm always jealous." Jay Spade says, "As long as there's no weather alert buzzes." Ugh, I still get chills at the sound of them. Nolan Hajimer says, "What do you use to edit?" I use Premiere Pro. It's easier than ever to get thanks to Adobe's new subscription service. And Gypsy Fox says, "Can't wait. Where's the popcorn? And time for another marshmallow over the flames in the fireplace." That sounds really good. I haven't had a roasted marshmallow in years. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.